Okay, so in this short talk we're going to be looking at design principles related to human-computer interaction, or HCI. So these tend to be overarching themes that support any time that you're designing something that involves human-computer interaction, be that screens, machines, or anything that has a microchip in it, effectively. So any computer device doesn't necessarily have to have a screen. Obviously these are core overarching themes. There are also user experience processes related to these themes. We're not going to talk about those in this particular talk. Okay, so there's three things you want to consider when thinking about design principles for human-computer interaction. One is that, the different types of things. So there are principles, and we're going to mainly be looking at those in this talk, and how you might have a set for human-computer interaction. So they might be more abstract design rules, such as an interface should be easy to navigate. Sometimes there's a move towards what's called like guidelines, which may be more about how to achieve that principle. So something like using a colour to highlight links, make it easier to navigate. So that's something to consider. And also we're going to mainly be covering principles and guidelines. And then we're going to be looking at standards as well at the very end of the talk, where these might be specific rules related to how you go about using like a logo or something like that. So, and we're also going to look at some standards that relate particularly to human-computer interaction that are very specific rules. Okay, so there's some very basic usability principles that Dix, Schneiderman and Priest came up with, which is about these three, which is learnability, flexibility and robustness. So you can think about these things here. So it's like, how easy is it for a user to learn something, to achieve the maximum performance? Is it flexible? So are there multiple ways that a user can exchange information and work with a system? And what is the level of support needed to determine it? So how robust is the system and the support needed? So we're going to go through this quite quickly, and then we're going to move on to some particular design principles. So learnability can come from predominantly design patterns. I'm sure you've seen many of these patterns. In fact, there's a website called ui-patterns.com that collects some of the most well-known. So these patterns like the tab bar system. So here we've got tabs, and you've probably seen that across many applications that you use. We've got the drop-down menu. So we know that this little disclosure triangle means a drop-down menu. More recently, we've seen this hamburger menu at the top left there, which again enables us to move things. And often these design patterns, you'll see them across lots and lots of apps and used in lots and lots of different ways. So, the learnability of these patterns can be really, really important. Of course, flexibility in how they work and use, it's got to be done, and sometimes that can be where different screens adapt some of the tab menus accordingly. So we see here, where we maybe have more space for icons, text, etc. They may be flexed accordingly, and we need a system that is robust, that allows us. So those are kind of overarching principles, learnability, flexibility and robustness. So our human-computer interaction needs to understand that at the basic level, and then there's some principles that we can apply on top of that for a few key people. So Ben Schneiderman came across the 8 golden rules. We're calling them principles, and I'm just going to give you some examples on how these are being utilised, and you can see them in different places. So strive for consistency, shortcuts, feedback, dialogues that say something, simple error handling, easy reversal of actions, so get full control over what you're doing, and reduce short-term memory load. So they're saying, you can achieve these principles in your interactions, then you will have a better user experience. So consistency, within Apple, the menu has stayed consistent for decades. So we know now through consistency that the menu will always be at the top on the Mac system, slightly different on Windows, but there's been a consistency on those platforms. Shortcuts, be that keyboard shortcuts or things, they're brought into most systems, so we can have a way of ensuring that we can speed up the process, and that's really useful for users that are coming back, that become what they call pro users. There's ways for them to increase the performance that they take within a piece of software. Informative feedback, so things like again on the Mac here, when we're dragging and dropping photos, we can see what is selected, what isn't, and how they're going to interact with that. So feedback in this instance is informative. We've got things like being informed that something is happening. So this is that a copy is in process and that it will finish. So making sure that we get there. We want to have good error handling. This is an example of seriously bad error handling. We have no idea what a fatal exception 0E is, and even to search that in Google is going to be quite tricky and will yield no good results. So we want to ensure that we communicate when something's gone wrong in a user-friendly way. This number may or may not mean something to Windows, who knows. Reversing things, so being able to undo stuff. So here, that's some of those principles, those golden rules from, here we go, Eric, there we go, Ben Schneiderman's golden rules in action: strive for consistency, shortcuts, feedback, dialog boxes that tell you what's happening, good error, easy reversal of actions, and full control. And then there's the other one is reducing short-term memory, so enabling users to find things again with quick access. Okay. 6 principles created by a guy called Don Norman, and this is from his book The Design of Everyday Things, a fantastic book. We'll be looking at that at the very end of this talk. So his principles have been sort of distilled down into these checkboxes: so visibility, feedback, constraints, mapping, consistency, and affordance. And what you'll start to see is that there's a lot of overlap between these kind of main sort of lead people in these kind of general principles. So visibility. So this is a basic principle, that the more visible an element is, the more likely people to use it. Yeah. So of course the opposite is true. The more out of sight it is, the more difficult it is to use, and the less likely people are going to know about it. So lots of current interfaces support gesture-based interfaces, so swipes and things. Snapchat being a prime example. It is near on impossible to figure out some of those gestures without being shown by someone, so it's too hidden. In this instance, we've seen like a move away from the hamburger menu item on the left, and sort of a lot of apps are moving back to tab-based interface because it makes those things much more visible, the ability to do certain things. So there's a bit of a change in that. Feedback. So this is just saying actions, need reactions. The principle of making clear what a user does. Also, feedback would cover those good error messages. So you don't want people guessing what's happening. So this is just a little clip from Google's material design, which just hopefully plays okay in the recording. But what you see is that when you're picking up objects, moving things around, that the feedback is instant. So there is a direct connection between what you're doing and the feedback that you're getting. Really, really important. Constraints. So this is about limiting a range of interactions. So to simplify the interface, guide the person to the next action. Make sure that there's clarity and limiting confusion. So this is an app called Clear, which just enables you to pull down to create an item, and you just type, and to get rid of it, you just swipe. So it's just super design constraints that just focus on the ability to create and clear to-do items. Again, you'll probably think of many apps where that's the case, but again, it's just thinking about how do I limit the range of interactive possibilities, reduce the number of steps. Mapping. So this is about how you map relationship between controls and effects they have on your app or in the world. This is obviously a cooker lid, where we can see the direct instant mapping. So you want that mapping to be as natural as possible. It's super confusing if you have a cooker like that on the left to know which one fires up which piece. Consistency. So again, this is just thinking about driving this across applications. Of course, you can look at Google's material design guidelines or iOS's human interaction guidelines, which give you some consistency that they would ask you to follow in designing apps for their computers, using either the Mac sort of guidelines, iOS guidelines, or Google's material guidelines. So that's something to consider when developing for particular platforms. Is there consistency you can follow? Are there patterns that you can follow? And then number 6 is affordances. So, there's something like, for example, a link that's underlined is a really strong affordance now on the web. That's a clickable link, and then there is a standard that says this, at least there was, saying this should be blue and underlined. Now we've kind of moved away from that necessarily being needed, and that the underline itself, is an indication. But there's something to think about. So in Don Norman's book, he talks predominantly about, it's become known as the Norman doors, which are doors that have one affordance, so there appears to be a pull handle, but when you walk up to the door and trying to pull it, it in fact turns out to be a push door. So really the affordance should be a push panel rather than a pull handle. So it's just thinking about what is the interface saying and telling people so they know where they're heading. Another thing, really interesting book from Jeff Raskin, one of the Apple designers early on, was this book called Humane Interfaces, the Humane Interface, sorry, and he talks about some principles as well. So these are really nice, and I've not got some exact examples for these. These are a little older, but again, it might be worth thinking about how to understand these. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So, when using a product to help you do a task, the product should only help and never distract you from the task. And he talks about a way of doing that is to make it that the interface should be habituating. To do that, it needs to be modeless and monotonous. So modeless means that it will have the same gestures intending results. So you won't go from one screen and find that swiping left suddenly makes you move to the right. And monotonous really is that there is not necessarily having to choose between multiple gestures to achieve certain tasks. So there should be one gesture. But I think the principle really is just that it should help you to do that task and shouldn't distract you. Something like Facebook, for example, is so about distracting and just taking your attention away that it doesn't really abide by this. The interface should be reliable. So, things like should work, and that's really important. And that you shouldn't, lose work. It should be as efficient and as simple as possible to use. So going back to those other principles. And the suitability of the interface can only be determined by testing. So this is when we get towards more user experience style approaches. And you just need to bear this in mind, that a suitable interface can only be determined by testing. And then the last one here is the interface should be pleasant in tone and visually attractive. Now, in summary of that, he tends to put that it should be effective, habituating, reliable, efficient, and tested. To the extent that doing so does not conflict with these essentials, an interface should also be attractive. I would argue at this point, actually, to undertake all of those things really, really well, that the interface should not only be attractive, but it should be delightfully empowering. So I think that actually now it's really important to think about how you enable an interface to be attractive, delightful, and thus encourage these modes. There's also Jacob Nielsen has 10 general principles for interaction design, which is worth taking a look at. We won't go into too much detail for his work. I would say personally that Don Norman, his 6 principles are probably the best ones to stick with. So do take a look at those and see where you can see that in action. Okay, so those tend to be the kind of overriding main principles that we see being utilized in human-computer interaction today. And they are great guides to get you going when you're just thinking about, deconstructing or creating interfaces. Now, there's a couple other ways that some of these things can be understood. There is standards. So there are web standards that have been around for a little while. There is also the ISO 9241-210-2010, which is the ISO standard that provides requirements for human-centered design principles and activities, as it says there, for computer-based interactive systems. So these are ways of ensuring that you abide by a whole bunch of rules and legislation effectively that ensures your system works as well as it can. They're pretty complicated. They were reviewed in 2015, so still totally relevant and worth having a look at if you want to get into the real kind of dry detail of standards that apply to HCI. And also you can look at the Web Standards project as well to see what standards they currently support and suggest. I would say that, you know, if you want to create super interesting interfaces, that likelihood is that you know, abiding by those initial principles will get you 9/10 of the way there. But of course, if you're working with a, you know, an organisation that is a government organisation, etc., you may need to ensure that you live up to certain standards in the ISO agreement as well. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that standards manuals have been around a long time in graphic design, and so you can look at standardsmanual.com. It's a great place to look at. And so I'm going to finish up with a couple of examples just of basic manuals and just show you how they function. So this is the 1970 New York City Transit Authority graphic standard manual. So it was just a whole book that explained how you would badge up the entire city transport for New York. So lots of guidelines, etc., on how you would do that. This one is the NASA graphic standard manual. So the same thing about how you would lay out, in this instance, how you'd lay out booklets, brochures, how you'd ensure that signage was appropriately managed across the NASA estate. And that could be not only just in, you know, vehicles, space shuttles, etc. This is a big piece of work to ensure that NASA had this standard, and everyone who was working on projects would get this, and the rules that they had to abide by would be all contained within the standards manual. Lufthansa, designed by Otto Eicher, was again a really early standards manual looking at how you'd ensure that there was consistency across. So these manuals again are kind of built out of those principles, but these maybe are a little bit more strict in the sense of how you'd have to use things, so much more like rules. Of course, nowadays they tend to be called brand guidelines, but actually I would really think you should refer to them as standards. Moving Brands, this is some of the brand guidelines they've produced for some of their clients, and you can go and look at those, which are really good. So there's a few here that again talk about how you might use assets. If you're putting together some design principles for a web process, a lot of people like to use what is called a style tile. So you can go to this website, Style Tiles, and pick up a little document that enables you to pull together, you know, colors, fonts, textures, and things that will give a mood or a principle for your website. And this kind of sits in between a standard and the principle, where it can be a little bit looser. It doesn't have to be the rigid rules. So that is a real quick whistle-stop tour of some of the design principles that relate to human-computer interaction design. Do take a look at the book by Don Norman, The Design of Everyday Things. You probably won't see the world in the same way ever again. He followed that up with Emotional Design, The Design of Everyday Things. That's a newer edition, so that's worth checking out. Emotional Design came a little bit later originally, and the last one there is The Principles and Process of Interaction Design, which again is an updated sort of look at some of those design principles, but in connection with interaction design.